Chapter 10 Endless Night. It was dark, so dark, and very cold. Marley held up the torch, and Rowan drew breath in amazement. Countless rainbow-colored spears of stone hung glistening from the soaring roof of the chamber. Strange squat shapes rose from its floor in groups and lines. The cave was huge. He could not see its ending. John took a step forward, glanced at his compass, then hesitated. "The compass needle is wavering," he said. "Something is interfering with its workings." "Metal in the rock, perhaps," suggested Marley. The torchlight flickered yellow on her face. She fidgeted, moving from foot to foot. "Perhaps. In any case, it would be foolish to rely on it too completely. But without it, how can we find the path we are to take? We could so easily become lost in this maze." "And take the path where children play," said Rowan. "That is what the map told us." "It would be a brave child who would venture here," Ellen observed. Rowan peered around him, standing on his toes and craning his neck until he saw what he had been searching for. "I think perhaps," he began, and faltered. Perhaps he was being foolish. He did not want to lead them astray or be laughed at. "Speak up, Rowan," urged Strong John. "This is not a time for anyone who has any plan at all to hold his tongue." It may be the stones," Rowan stammered. He pointed. "Those stones that are smaller than others over there, there's a space between them like a path, and their shapes—" "Of course!" Alan took the torch from Marley and led them to the spot. Sure enough, 2 lines of strange stones, bent and knobbly, like children tumbling and crawling, climbed off into the darkness. Between them wound a clear, sandy path. "So our way is marked for us," said John with satisfaction, putting away his compass. "And now we look for a face that breathes with sighs and has gleaming eyes," Alan laughed. "That should be interesting." He led them up the path, the torch lighting the way in front of him. Looking back, Rowan saw the cavern receding into darkness. Endless night. He shivered. They moved on, upward, always upward. They were climbing through the center of the mountain. Rowan tried not to think of the tons of rock and earth that surrounded them, pressing down, cutting off light and air. If they were lost here, no one would ever find them. If they would wander in endless night until they died, and the mountain would be their tomb. He pushed the fear down, but it grew and pressed on his belly, and his heart, making it hard to breathe. Higher and higher they climbed, through one chamber to the next. By their sides the rocky children bent and stretched in a game that had no ending. The climbers said little, for the way was steep. The silence was as thick around them as darkness. Rowan listened to the hissing of the torch, to his own breath, to Marley's panting behind him, and the sound of John's boots crushing in sand and hitting rock in front. "Another cavern!" Alan's voice boomed back to them from walls they could not see. They heard him scrambling forward, and the torchlight disappeared. "The face!" he exclaimed. "The face is—" His voice trailed off. "Alan, what is it?" shouted Marley, pushing forward. "Alan, answer! Alan, bring the light back! We cannot see!" "The face!" he called. His voice sounded strange, as though he were choking. "It is here. Come, but slowly." The torchlight reappeared, and cautiously they climbed toward it. Alan was standing by a wide gap in the rock. He did not smile as they reached his side, but he thrust the torch through the gap. "See for yourselves," he said, "but again take care." They squeezed through the opening into the cave beyond. Rods of white and yellow stone hung thickly from the roof, but the black and shining floor below the ledge on which they stood was as smooth as glass. Facing them, on the far side, was a wall of rock. A wall with a bulging lump in the middle. A lump shaped like a face, looking down. They saw the twisted rocky nose, swollen cheeks, slitted mouth, broad chin, and gleaming eyes that cast beams of light across the floor. "Your way is marked by lines of light." There was sound here, too, a sighing, whistling, breathy sound. "It breathes," whispered Marley. "The face breathes, as the rhyme foretold." "A passage on that side must open to the air," exclaimed John. "That is the outside air we hear, Marley. We have climbed far in these caverns. We must surely be almost at our journey's end." "I fear," said Alan in a strange voice, "that at least I am at my journey's end for now." He was standing with his back pressed against the cavern wall, and as they stared at him, he slid down until he was sitting on the ground. "Alan, get up!" Marley ordered. "What game are you playing?" "I would not have come if I had known," Alan said wearily. "But how could I have known? Who would have ever dreamed it possible? He rubbed at his eyes, shaking his head. Alan, we do not know what you mean. Come, we must move on. Strong John frowned and turned away. As he did so, his boot kicked a pebble from the ledge, and it fell to the shiny black floor. There was a splash, and the pebble disappeared. Ripples spread in silent, ever-increasing circles across the smooth surface of what they had all mistaken for solid ground. Water, said Alan. He looked haggard. The cave is half full of water, deep water, for it is black and cold and you cannot see the bottom. So? Demanded Marley. So we put up with some cold and swim. Alan raised his eyebrows. But you see, Marley, my dear, I cannot swim. What? They gaped at him. He stared back defiantly. It is not a skill the travelers teach their young, he said. The travelers sensibly leave swimming to the Maris folk. After all, they are the ones who get their living from the sea and have webbed feet and hands to make the whole miserable business more efficient. The travelers refuse to have anything to do with water in larger quantities than a tin tub will hold. But in Rin we all learn to swim, Rowan burst out. We have to, as soon as we can walk practically. We have to go to the coast or the river on the plains specially to learn. He winced, remembering those lessons in the river. He had learned to swim in the end, but he had not enjoyed it. Alan smiled bitterly. Ah, yes, in Rin it is different. In Rin you must have every physical skill, of course, or you are regarded as useless, even if you live far inland. Even if you have to travel a day and a night to practice swimming, and may never swim from one year to the next or ever again in your life, you still must be able to swim, as you must be able to climb, fight, run, and so on and so on. Such things in Rin are thought so important. They are important, cried Marley. A person must be prepared for whatever adventure he or she might meet. As we can see right now, Alan. She faced him despairingly. So you did not learn to swim as a small child. That is unfortunate. But why on earth did you not learn once you arrived in Rin? Alan glared at her. Was I not already a figure of fun and ridicule? I, the strange-looking, skinny traveler boy, who had never worn shoes and knew nothing of your village ways? At 10 years old, the taunts of other children are very hard to bear. Rowan will tell you that. He glanced at Rowan, who nodded silently. So he had been right. Alan had understood how he felt. Marley took Alan's arm. I understand, Alan. But you could have asked about swimming lessons. He rounded on her. No, you do not understand. Was I to make even more of a clown of myself by letting those bullies under the teaching tree know of my weakness? I could not teach myself in secret. There's no water in Rin but the stream, and the bookshop pool. I would have to ask to be taken to the river on the plains for lessons with 3-year-olds. How Ellis would have crowed over that! He shrugged, twisting his face into a comical mask. And, as you can imagine, the longer I waited, the more impossible it became, he said. Before I knew it, I was that unthinkable thing, an adult of Rin who could not swim. He smiled. It did not matter, of course, he went on softly. It did not matter a jot. Until now. Strong John shook his head. There must be a way, he began. If you just... John, you must accept this as I have. I cannot swim. Not a stroke, said Alan firmly. So, if you were thinking of helping this lame duck along, pulling him by one useless wing, perhaps, think again. The water is icy. You will have enough trouble keeping yourselves afloat without attempting to stop me from drowning also. The ropes will not stretch across to the other side, so put that out of your minds as well. This is why you never take the chance to visit the coast on the market days, Alan. John looked at him thoughtfully. I often wondered. Well, now your wonderings are at an end, Alan smiled, but he turned his head away. Marley bit her lip. You cannot return to Rin alone now, Alan, she burst out at last. The swamp will surely be your death without a partner. I have thought of this. Alan brushed at his coat, as though removing the dried mud that clung there was all that was important to him. I will make camp beside the cave mouth. I will wait for you there. He laughed bitterly. I had thought to be a hero of Rin, show them what the half-traveler could do. Who would have thought that such a small weakness would be my undoing, and that because of my foolish pride I would let down my friends? He did not look at Strong John. I would give much for it to not be so. Forgive me. 7 parts the journey make, 7 ways the heart will break. But John put out his hand. There is nothing to forgive, old friend. Wait for our return. Make more torches if you can find good wood. We will need them. He hesitated, then went on in a lower voice. He had turned his head away from Rowan, but Rowan still heard what he said. If we do not return in 3 days, Alan, you must wait no longer. You must find your way back to Rin somehow, to those who love us. Better that they hear the worst than they do not hear at all. Is this agreed?" "Agreed." Alan took John's hand and squeezed it warmly. "Let us go, then," said Marley. Her eyes were full of tears. She threw her arms around Alan. "We will be back," she whispered. "Take care. And you, Marley." John, Rowan, and Marley stripped off their boots and outer clothes and stuffed them into their packs. Then, shivering, they entered the water and began swimming. It was indeed bitterly cold, so cold that Rowan's flesh first stung and then grew numb. The water flooded his mouth, harsh and sour. Across the black pool they crept, sidling like crabs along the lines of light, striking out with their right hands, holding their packs with their left hands so that they dragged along behind them, half in and half out of the water. Nameless things brushed Rowan's feet and legs as he swam. He clenched his teeth at the thought of them, but kept pulling himself along with an arm that grew heavier and slower with every stroke. Soon he was in agony, but worse than the pain of continuing was the thought of sinking down into this black, still hole, never to see light and air again. Then his hand struck rock, and with a wave of relief he realized he could stand. He looked up. The huge stone face was above him. Marley was already climbing out of the pool, gasping and dripping. Behind him, strong John heaved his pack out of the water as he, too, reached the shore. All of them turned, called to Alan, who was waiting anxiously on the other side. They were standing in the shadow, so he could not see them, but he lifted the torch high in response to their shouts. At least he knew they were safe. Marley bent and offered a hand to help haul Rowan up beside her. His teeth were chattering so much that he could not speak. He jumped up and down to warm himself. With cold, clumsy fingers, Marley unbuckled his pack and pulled out the clothes he had stripped off before the swim. "Take off your wet things and put these on before you freeze to death," she advised. "They are a little damp, but better than nothing." Rowan knew he couldn't do that, not in front of Marley. He didn't even undress in front of his mother any more. He hesitated. "By my life, Rowan!" Marley exclaimed in amused exploration, her own clothes clutched in her arms. "You've been menaced by giant spiders, nearly smothered in a swamp, and now half drowned and frozen, and you're embarrassed about taking your clothes off in front of me? Does that not seem ridiculous?" "Not at all," Strong John was grinning as he came up behind them. "I completely understand. Some things a man simply cannot do. I suggest you turn your back, Marley. Then modesty can be preserved, and we can all get warm without delay."